The manila folder had been sitting on my dining room table for 3 weeks, growing heavier with each passing day. As I arranged the final place settings for Thanksgiving dinner, my fingers brushed against its worn edges, and I wondered if today would finally be the day I'd need to open it. The turkey was golden brown, the house smelled like sage and butter, and my family was about to arrive for what I hoped wouldn't be our last holiday together. Comment below and tell me what state you're celebrating in this year. Little did I know that by dessert, everything I thought I knew about loyalty would crumble like pie crust. My son Marcus walked through the front door first, his wife Jennifer close behind, both wearing expressions I'd never seen before. Their usual warmth had been replaced by something colder, more calculating, like they'd rehearsed this moment. My daughter Sarah arrived minutes later with her husband Tom, and even my youngest David seemed unusually quiet as he helped his girlfriend Lisa out of her coat. The folder seemed to pulse with importance as I watched them exchange glances I wasn't meant to understand. "Mom, we need to talk before we eat," Marcus said, his voice carrying an authority that didn't belong at my table. Jennifer nodded beside him, her perfectly manicured hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Sarah avoided my eyes entirely, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on my grandmother's china. The room felt charged with unspoken tensions, and I found myself unconsciously moving closer to the folder, as if it might somehow protect me from whatever storm was brewing. Marcus cleared his throat and straightened his shoulders like he was delivering a business presentation. "We've all been talking, and we've come to a decision about your living situation." His words hit me like ice water, each syllable carefully measured and rehearsed. Jennifer reached into her oversized purse and pulled out a trifold brochure that she placed next to my folder. The glossy photos showed smiling elderly people in a place called Sunset Manor, and suddenly the room felt like it was spinning. "This is one of the finest assisted living facilities in the county," Jennifer continued, her real estate agent voice taking over. "The monthly fee is $4,800, and they have an opening available December 1st. Sarah finally looked up, tears threatening to spill, but she didn't contradict her sister-in-law. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Lisa excused herself to the bathroom, clearly wanting no part of this family intervention. The folder under my palm felt warm now, like it was alive and waiting for its moment. I stared at the brochure, then at each of my children's faces, searching for any sign of the people who used to fight over who got to sit next to Mom during movie nights. "You want to put me in a home?" The words came out as a whisper, barely audible over the gentle bubbling of gravy on the stove. Marcus leaned forward, his expression softening for just a moment before hardening again into business mode. The folder seemed to grow heavier as I realized this wasn't a discussion. It was a verdict they'd already reached without me. "It's not putting you anywhere, Mom," Sarah said, finally finding her voice. "It's about getting you the care you need as you age." Her husband Tom nodded supportively, though I noticed he couldn't quite meet my eyes either. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were discussing my future while sitting around the table I'd bought with my own money. In the house I'd worked 3 jobs to keep after their father died. But they didn't know about the folder yet, and that ignorance was about to cost them everything they thought they understood about our family dynamics. Marcus pulled out a manila envelope from his briefcase, much thinner than my folder, but apparently filled with legal documents. "We've already spoken with an elder care attorney about the best way to handle your assets during the transition," he said, spreading papers across my tablecloth like he was conducting a board meeting. The numbers I glimpsed made my stomach clench. Estimates for my house value, calculations for care costs, projections for how long my savings might last. They'd been planning this for months, maybe longer, treating my life like a business problem to be solved rather than a family conversation to be had. Jennifer leaned forward with practiced sympathy, her voice taking on the tone she probably used with difficult home sellers. "We know this is hard to hear, but you're 72 now, and living alone in this big house just isn't safe anymore." She gestured around my perfectly maintained kitchen, my spotless counters, my organized spice rack that proved I was anything but helpless. David finally spoke up, his voice cracking slightly. "We love you, Mom, but we worry about you every single day." The folder pulsed beneath my fingers like a heartbeat, reminding me that worry was about to become the least of their concerns. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed me a spreadsheet she'd created, complete with color-coded categories for my monthly expenses. "We've calculated that after selling the house and your car, you'll have enough for about 6 years at Sunset Manor," she said, her accounting background evident in every perfectly aligned column. 6 years. They'd reduced my entire future to a mathematical equation, and apparently I was expected to be grateful for their efficiency. The folder grew warm against my palm as I realized they'd forgotten one crucial variable in all their careful calculations. "What if I don't want to go?" I asked quietly, my voice barely carrying over the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The question hung in the air like smoke, and I watched as my children exchanged those looks again, the ones that said they'd prepared for this objection. Marcus straightened his tie, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood, and I saw a flash of the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. But that little boy had grown into a man who was about to break my heart with his next words. Marcus looked directly at me for the first time since arriving, his jaw set with grim determination. "Mom, we all agreed. If you won't go willingly, we'll have to pursue other options." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, and I felt Sarah flinch beside him even as she nodded in agreement. Other options. Legal options. They were prepared to declare me incompetent if I didn't comply with their plans. The folder beneath my hand seemed to throb with anticipation, as if it knew its time was finally approaching. Jennifer reached across the table and patted my free hand with false gentleness. "It's really for the best, Mom," she said, using the same tone she'd probably use with a confused child. "At your age, these kinds of decisions are better left to people who can think clearly about your future." The condescension in her voice made my teeth ache, but I kept my expression neutral, even as my grip tightened on the folder that contained everything they needed to know about my mental clarity. They thought they were dealing with a helpless old woman, and that misconception was about to become their biggest mistake. The dining room fell silent except for the tick of the clock and the distant sound of the oven timer counting down the minutes until the sweet potatoes would be done. David cleared his throat nervously and glanced toward the kitchen, probably hoping the meal would interrupt this terrible conversation. But Marcus wasn't finished delivering his prepared speech, and I could see him gathering himself for the final blow, the one that would either destroy our family forever or force me to reveal the contents of the folder that had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. Marcus straightened his shoulders and delivered his final verdict with the cold precision of a judge reading a sentence. "We all agreed. You're not family anymore if you're going to be selfish about this." The words hit like physical blows, each syllable designed to cut deep and force my compliance. Sarah gasped and covered her mouth as if she hadn't expected him to actually say those words aloud, while David's face went pale as parchment. Even Jennifer looked momentarily startled by her husband's brutality, though she quickly composed herself and squeezed his arm in support. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. 72 years old, and my own children had just disowned me for refusing to disappear quietly into a nursing home so they could divide up my life like a liquidation sale. They sat there waiting for me to break down, to beg forgiveness, to promise I'd be good and go where they wanted me to go. Instead, I lifted the folder from the table and placed it squarely in front of Marcus, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "Before you make any more decisions about what I can and can't do," I said, my voice finding strength I didn't know I still possessed, "I think you should see what's inside this folder." Marcus looked confused, as if he'd forgotten there were any secrets left in the world that didn't revolve around his plans for my future. Jennifer leaned forward with obvious curiosity, while Sarah's eyes went wide with something that looked suspiciously like fear. The folder sat between us like a challenge, its manila surface hiding truths that would reshape everything they thought they knew about power dynamics in our family. Marcus reached for the folder with the same confidence he'd shown all evening, clearly expecting to find outdated insurance papers or sentimental photographs. But his expression changed the moment he opened it and saw the letterhead of Morrison, Klein & Associates, the most prestigious law firm in the state. His face went from smugly superior to genuinely confused as he began reading the first document, his eyes scanning lines of legal text that were clearly not what he'd expected to find. Jennifer tried to read over his shoulder, but he instinctively pulled the papers closer, his businessman's instincts recognizing the significance of what he was seeing even before his brain could fully process it. "What is this?" Marcus whispered, his voice losing all its earlier authority. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the first document to reveal another beneath it, then another. A whole stack of legal papers that represented months of careful planning on my part. Sarah leaned forward, her face pale with growing understanding, while David's girlfriend Lisa quietly returned from the bathroom and immediately sensed that the entire dynamic in the room had shifted. The folder had done exactly what I'd hoped it would do. It had turned the hunters into the hunted with a single revelation. The first document was a power of attorney revocation, signed and notarized just 3 weeks ago, removing Marcus as my designated agent and replacing him with someone whose loyalty could never be questioned. The second was a will amendment, dated 2 weeks ago, redistributing my assets in ways that would shock them all. But it was the third document that made Marcus's face go completely white. A real estate contract showing that I'd already sold the house to my neighbor's granddaughter Emma for exactly $400,000, with a life estate provision that allowed me to live here until I died. "You sold the house?" Sarah's voice came out as a strangled gasp, her carefully calculated spreadsheet suddenly worthless. "To Emma Rodriguez? That girl is barely 25 years old." Jennifer snatched the contract from Marcus's trembling fingers, her real estate expertise allowing her to quickly scan the terms and conditions. What she found there made her jaw drop open in shock, because the sale wasn't just legally binding, it was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications for their plans. Emma needed a place to live while she finishes medical school, and I needed someone I could trust to inherit something meaningful, I explained calmly, watching as Jennifer found the life estate clause that guaranteed me residence until death. "She pays me $1,200 monthly in rent, which covers my property taxes and utilities quite nicely." The monthly payment was actually much lower than market rate, but Emma had agreed to it because she understood the real value wasn't in the money. It was in the security and the relationships that money could never buy. Marcus flipped to the next document and found something that made him physically recoil from the table. It was a medical evaluation from Dr. Patricia Weinstein, dated just 1 week ago, declaring me mentally competent and physically capable of independent living. The evaluation had cost me $800, but it was worth every penny to see the look on his face as he read Dr. Weinstein's assessment of my cognitive abilities, my physical health, and my complete capacity to make my own legal and financial decisions without any need for guardianship or conservatorship. "The doctor's evaluation was Jennifer's idea, actually," I said with a slight smile, remembering how my daughter-in-law had suggested I was losing my mental faculties during our last phone call. She mentioned that confused elderly people often don't realize they need help, so I decided to get professionally evaluated to make sure I was thinking clearly about my future. Jennifer's face turned an interesting shade of red as she realized her own words had prompted me to seek the very documentation that now protected me from their schemes. But the document that truly devastated their carefully laid plans was buried deeper in the folder. A trust agreement establishing the Margaret Thompson Family Education Fund with the initial funding of $650,000. Marcus's hands shook as he read the terms, which provided college tuition assistance for family members who maintained respectful relationships with the trust administrator. The trust administrator, of course, was me, with Emma as my successor, and the respectful relationship clause had very specific definitions about what constituted family loyalty and what constituted elder abuse. Sarah found her voice first, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Mom, you put almost everything into a trust?" The numbers were staggering when laid out in black and white. My life savings, the proceeds from selling my late husband's business, even the small inheritance I'd received from my sister last year. Instead of leaving everything to my children to fight over after I died, I'd created a mechanism that would force them to earn their inheritance through demonstrated love and respect, not just biological connection. The trust pays for education expenses, college, trade school, medical school, law school, anything that helps family members build better lives, I explained, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Emma qualifies because she's been like a granddaughter to me, visiting twice a week and helping with groceries without being asked. David's girlfriend Lisa smiled slightly, probably remembering her own student loans and realizing that kindness might actually have monetary value in this family. But my biological children sat frozen, finally understanding that their carefully calculated inheritance had just evaporated before their eyes. Marcus flipped frantically through the remaining documents, finding bank statements showing accounts they'd never known existed, and investment portfolios that proved I was anything but the confused old woman they'd painted me as. The final document in the folder was perhaps the most devastating of all, a detailed financial statement prepared by my accountant, Harold Chen, showing my net worth at just over $1.2 million. They'd been planning to warehouse me in a nursing home while fighting over crumbs, never realizing that their mother had been quietly building wealth for years through careful investments and strategic planning. "How long have you been planning this?" Jennifer asked, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Her dreams of quick house sale commissions and easy asset transfers were crumbling with each page she read. The truth was that I'd been quietly reshaping my financial life ever since I overheard Marcus on the phone 6 months ago, discussing my situation with his siblings like I was already dead. That conversation had been my wake-up call, and every document in this folder represented a step I'd taken to protect myself from the very people who should have been protecting me. I started making changes the day I realized my own children were discussing my funeral arrangements while I was still perfectly capable of making my own decisions, I said quietly. Marcus had the grace to look ashamed for a moment, but Jennifer's face hardened with calculation as she began looking for loopholes in the legal documents. She wouldn't find any. Harold Chen and his law partner had been thorough in their preparations, anticipating every possible challenge my children might raise and closing every legal avenue they might try to pursue. The oven timer chose that moment to chime, announcing that the sweet potatoes were done, but nobody moved toward the kitchen. The Thanksgiving feast I'd spent days preparing sat cooling on the counter while my family stared at the documents that had just rewritten all their assumptions about power and money and family loyalty. Emma's timing couldn't have been more perfect. She knocked on the front door at exactly 4:15, just as she'd promised when I'd asked her to join us for dessert. "That must be Emma," I said, rising from my chair with more energy than I'd felt in months. I invited her to join us for pie since she's technically family now. The legal documents had been powerful, but watching my children meet the young woman who'd inherited their childhood home would be the real test of their character. As I walked toward the front door, I could hear them whispering frantically behind me, their carefully rehearsed intervention having backfired so spectacularly that they were left scrambling for any way to regain control of the situation they'd created. Emma stood on my porch holding a beautiful bouquet of autumn flowers and a homemade pumpkin bread that smelled like cinnamon and nutmeg. At 25, she had the kind of genuine smile that lit up her entire face, and when she hugged me, I felt more warmth than I'd experienced from my own family in months. "Happy Thanksgiving, Margaret," she said, using the respectful formality I'd requested when we first met, though her affection was unmistakable. Behind me, I could hear chairs scraping against the floor as my children stood to meet the young woman who just inherited what they'd considered their birthright. "Emma, I'd like you to meet my children," I said, gesturing toward the dining room where 3 adults stood frozen like deer in headlights. "Marcus, Sarah, and David. This is Emma Rodriguez, my neighbor's granddaughter and the new owner of this house." Emma stepped forward with her hand extended, her medical school training evident in the confident way she approached potentially awkward social situations. But my children's responses ranged from Sarah's reluctant handshake to Marcus's barely civil nod to David's genuinely curious expression as he tried to process how a complete stranger had ended up owning his childhood home. "It's so nice to finally meet you all," Emma said with sincere warmth. "Your mother talks about you constantly, and I feel like I already know you." The irony in her words was almost painful, given that they'd been planning to declare me incompetent while I'd been praising their accomplishments to a virtual stranger who'd shown me more kindness in 6 months than they'd shown in years. Jennifer stepped forward with her practiced real estate smile, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes as she calculated ways to challenge the sale or find legal grounds to contest the transfer. Emma pulled a folder from her oversized medical school backpack and set it on the dining room table next to the one that had already changed everything. "I brought the documents Margaret requested," she said simply. "The signed lease agreement, the property insurance transfer, and the maintenance schedule we discussed." Marcus reached for Emma's folder with obvious desperation, but she gently intercepted his hand with the kind of firm politeness she probably used with difficult patients. The folder stayed closed, its contents another mystery that would have to wait for the right moment to be revealed. "What's in that folder?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. She'd just watched her inheritance disappear into legal documents she couldn't challenge. And now another folder had appeared, with more papers that might further complicate their demolished plans. Emma glanced at me with a questioning look, clearly unsure how much she should reveal about our private arrangements. The decision was mine to make, and I found myself torn between protecting her from my family's anger and letting them see just how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered by their own assumptions. "Emma's folder contains the maintenance agreements for this house," I said carefully. "Since she owns it now, she's responsible for upkeep and repairs, but she's also entitled to make improvements and renovations as she sees fit." The implications hit Jennifer first. As a real estate agent, she understood that Emma could potentially increase the property value significantly over the years, making it an even better investment than my children had realized. But more than that, Emma could change the house, update it, modernize it, and turn their childhood home into something completely different without asking anyone's permission. David found his voice for the first time since reading the legal documents. "Emma, can I ask you something?" His tone was respectful, curious rather than hostile, and I felt a flutter of hope that at least one of my children might handle this revelation with some grace. Emma nodded encouragingly, her medical training evident in the patient way she listened to difficult questions. What David asked next surprised everyone in the room, including me. "Are you planning to live here after you graduate medical school?" David's question cut straight to the heart of the matter that none of his siblings had been brave enough to address. If Emma was planning a long-term future in this house, then their childhood home would never come back to the family, no matter how much they might want to contest the sale. Emma smiled gently, her response revealing just how thoroughly I'd chosen my successor. "I'm hoping to do my residency at the university hospital, which is only 15 minutes from here," Emma replied. "After that, I'd love to set up a family practice in this neighborhood. There's definitely a need for a Spanish-speaking physician in this community." Her answer revealed not just her professional plans, but her deep connection to the area where I'd raised my children. Unlike my own kids, who'd all moved to suburbs 20 minutes away and visited only on holidays, Emma understood the value of roots and community connections. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out strained and desperate. "Emma, I don't suppose you'd be interested in selling the house back to the family? We could offer you a fair profit on your investment." His suggestion was pathetic in its transparency, and I watched Emma's expression shift from polite interest to something more protective. She'd witnessed enough of this conversation to understand that my children hadn't exactly been supportive of my independence, and her loyalty was already clear from the way she positioned herself slightly between them and me. "I'm sorry, but this house isn't for sale," Emma said firmly. "Margaret and I have a long-term arrangement that works well for both of us." She gestured around the dining room with obvious affection. "Besides, I've already started thinking of this as home." Her words hit my children like physical blows because they highlighted everything they'd taken for granted. The assumption that home would always be available to them, that their mother would always be waiting for them, that family meant automatic inheritance rather than earned relationship. Jennifer's real estate instincts finally kicked in, and she leaned forward with renewed determination. "What exactly did you pay for the house?" The question was rude and none of her business, but Emma answered with the kind of professional courtesy she'd probably learned from dealing with difficult hospital administrators. The purchase price she named, $400,000, was at least $50,000 below market value, which meant I'd essentially gifted Emma the equity in exchange for security and companionship. "That seems like a very generous price," Sarah said carefully, her accounting mind obviously calculating the lost inheritance represented by my below-market sale. What she didn't understand was that Emma's presence in my life was worth far more than $50,000 in equity. The young woman had helped me carry groceries up the front steps, had spent hours teaching me how to use my new smartphone, had driven me to medical appointments when winter weather made me nervous about driving myself. No amount of money could purchase that kind of genuine care and attention. Emma opened her folder and pulled out a document that made Jennifer's eyes widen with professional interest. The sale also included a renovation budget of $75,000, Emma explained. Margaret insisted on funding updates to the electrical system, the plumbing, and the kitchen appliances before I move in officially next month. The renovation budget was news to my children, who'd been calculating my net worth based on outdated assumptions about my liquid assets. Every document they'd read today had revealed another surprise, another way their mother had been planning for a future that didn't revolve around their convenience. Marcus stood abruptly, his face flushed with frustration and anger. "This is insane, Mom. You've given away everything we thought." He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but we all knew what he'd been about to say. Everything they thought belonged to them. Everything they'd been counting on to supplement their own retirement funds or pay for their children's educations. The entitlement in his unfinished sentence hung in the air like smoke, making Emma visibly uncomfortable and reminding me why I'd made these changes in the first place. "What you thought was yours was never actually yours," I said quietly, my voice carrying a strength that surprised even me. "I spent 43 years building a life after your father died, and I have every right to decide how that life continues and who benefits from the work I've done." Emma nodded supportively beside me, her presence a reminder that family isn't always determined by biology. Sometimes it's determined by who shows up, who cares, who treats you with dignity instead of viewing you as a problem to be managed. The front door opened without warning, and my neighbor Maria Rodriguez, Emma's grandmother, walked in carrying a casserole dish and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she knew exactly what had been happening in my dining room. At 78, Maria was 6 years older than me, but moved with the energy of someone half her age. She set the casserole on my counter and walked directly to Emma, placing a protective hand on her granddaughter's shoulder, while surveying the scene with the shrewd eyes of someone who'd raised 6 children and outlived 2 husbands. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Maria said, in the tone of someone who knew perfectly well that she was interrupting something crucial and was delighted to do so. Her timing couldn't have been more perfect. My children were just beginning to process the full implications of Emma's ownership of the house, and Maria's arrival added another layer of complexity to their demolished plans. She looked around the table at the scattered legal documents and smiled with obvious satisfaction. "Maria, I'd like you to meet my children," I said, grateful for her presence. "Marcus, Sarah, and David. This is Maria Rodriguez, Emma's grandmother and my closest neighbor." Maria had lived 3 houses down for over 30 years, and in the past 6 months, she'd become more of a daughter to me than my actual daughter had been. While my children lived their busy lives 20 minutes away, Maria checked on me daily, shared vegetables from her garden, and invited me to family celebrations where I was treated as an honored guest rather than an obligation. "Your mother is a treasure," Maria announced, her slight accent adding warmth to words that felt like a rebuke to my children's behavior. Emma and I consider ourselves blessed to have her as family. The word family hung in the air with deliberate emphasis, reminding everyone in the room that there were different ways to define kinship. Maria's presence transformed the dynamic entirely. Suddenly, it wasn't just Emma who'd inherited their mother's house, it was Emma and her entire extended family network that had claimed me as one of their own. Marcus made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I hope you understand that these legal arrangements might not be—" But Maria cut him off with the kind of sharp look that had probably terrified her own children into good behavior decades ago. Her protection of both Emma and me was fierce and immediate, and I realized that in gaining Emma as a tenant and friend, I'd also gained Maria as an ally who wouldn't tolerate any disrespect toward people she considered family. "These legal arrangements are none of your business," Maria said firmly. "Your mother is a grown woman who can make her own decisions about her own property." She pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited, claiming her space at my table with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Her presence changed everything because it proved that I wasn't alone. that I had support systems my children knew nothing about, and that their assumptions about my isolation and vulnerability were completely unfounded. Emma opened her folder again and pulled out another document that made my heart swell with gratitude and pride. "Actually, I have something else to share," she said, looking at me with excitement dancing in her eyes. "I got my acceptance letter yesterday. I've been chosen for the family medicine residency program at University Hospital, which means I'll be staying in this area for the next 3 years." The news was wonderful, but its implications for my children's hopes were devastating. Any lingering dreams they might have harbored about somehow reversing my decisions had just been crushed by Emma's long-term commitment to the community. Sarah was the first to truly understand what Emma's residency meant. "So you're planning to stay here permanently?" Her voice carried a note of finality, the sound of someone accepting defeat. Emma nodded enthusiastically, her joy in her professional achievement obvious and infectious. For a young woman from a working-class family, getting into a competitive residency program was a tremendous accomplishment, and I felt proud to have played a small role in making her dreams possible by providing stable, affordable housing during this crucial period of her career. The residency program has a community service component that focuses on providing healthcare to underserved populations, Emma explained. "I'll be working with elderly patients, recent immigrants, and families who don't have easy access to medical care." Her description of her future work hit another nerve with my children because it highlighted the irony of their situation. They'd been planning to warehouse me in a nursing home while Emma was dedicating her career to keeping elderly people healthy and independent in their own homes. David surprised everyone by standing up and extending his hand to Emma again, this time with genuine warmth. "Congratulations on your acceptance," he said sincerely. "That's a really impressive achievement." His girlfriend Lisa smiled approvingly at his graciousness, and I felt a spark of hope that at least one of my children might be capable of rising above disappointment to show basic human decency. David had always been the most emotionally mature of my children, perhaps because he'd been youngest when his father died and had learned early that life doesn't always go according to plan. Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared frustration, but they couldn't argue with David's gracious response without revealing themselves to be even more petty than they'd already appeared. Jennifer sat silent, probably calculating whether there were any remaining legal challenges she could suggest, while Maria watched the entire exchange with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts about people had been proven correct. The power dynamics in the room had shifted completely from where they'd started, and everyone could feel it. "I think it's time we serve dinner," I announced, rising from my chair with more energy than I'd felt in months. The legal documents had done their work. The revelations had been made, and now we could either move forward as a family or acknowledge that some relationships couldn't survive the truth about what they'd really been built on. Emma immediately stood to help, as did Maria and David's girlfriend Lisa, while my own children sat frozen in their chairs, still processing the wreckage of their carefully laid plans. As we moved toward the kitchen to retrieve the meal I'd spent days preparing, I heard Marcus whisper urgently to Jennifer, "There has to be something we can do about this." His words confirmed what I'd suspected all along. They weren't concerned about my welfare or my happiness, only about the inheritance they'd assumed would be waiting for them. But Emma heard the whisper too, and the protective look that crossed her face reminded me that I'd chosen my ally well when I'd decided to trust her with my future. The Thanksgiving dinner that followed was surreal in its strange mixture of tension and normalcy. Maria helped me serve the turkey, while Emma carved it with the precision she'd learned in anatomy class. David and Lisa made genuine conversation about Emma's studies and Maria's garden, while Marcus, Sarah, and Jennifer maintained strained silence, broken only by occasional requests to pass dishes. The meal I'd prepared with such hope for family reconciliation had become something entirely different, a celebration of new relationships and a funeral for old assumptions. As we ate, Emma told stories about her medical school experiences that made Maria beam with grandmother's pride and kept David and Lisa engaged with questions about her future specialty plans. Her presence at my table felt natural and right in a way that my own children's attendance somehow didn't. She helped clear dishes without being asked, complimented my cooking with genuine enthusiasm, and treated Maria and me with the kind of respect that should have been automatic from my own family, but clearly wasn't. After dinner, as I was preparing to serve the pumpkin pie Emma had brought, Marcus made one final attempt to salvage something from the ruins of his plans. "Mom, we need to discuss what happens if you have a medical emergency or need care that Emma can't provide." His concern sounded reasonable on the surface, but everyone at the table could hear the underlying hope that my arrangements might still prove inadequate and force me to depend on him. What he didn't know was that Emma and I had already discussed medical emergencies extensively, and our preparations were far more thorough than anything he'd planned. "Actually, that's already been arranged," Emma said calmly, pulling yet another document from her seemingly inexhaustible folder. "Margaret has designated me as her healthcare proxy, and I've prepared detailed emergency protocols based on her medical history and preferences." The document she showed them was thick and professionally bound, clearly the work of someone with medical training who understood both the legal requirements and the practical realities of emergency care for elderly patients. Sarah leaned forward with renewed interest, her accounting mind probably hoping to find flaws in Emma's preparations. "What kind of protocols?" she asked, her tone suggesting she doubted that someone Emma's age could possibly understand the complexities of elder care. Emma's response revealed just how thoroughly she'd researched and planned for every contingency they could imagine. Emergency contact lists including all family members, detailed medical history with current medications and allergies, preferences for end-of-life care, financial power of attorney information, and direct communication channels with Margaret's primary care physician and cardiologist, Emma recited from memory. "I've also arranged for backup care through the University Hospital's Geriatric Services Department if needed." Her preparations were more comprehensive than anything my children had ever discussed with me, despite their claims to be worried about my medical needs. Maria added her own contribution to the conversation. "My daughter Rosa is a registered nurse at the hospital, and she's agreed to be on call for any non-emergency medical questions that might come up." The network of support that had grown around me without my children's knowledge was impressive in its scope and depth. While they'd been planning to isolate me in a nursing home, I'd been building connections with people who actually wanted to help me maintain my independence and dignity. Jennifer finally spoke up, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "This all sounds very nice, but what happens when Emma gets too busy with her residency to provide adequate attention? Medical residents work 80-hour weeks. She won't have time to be checking on an elderly woman every day." Her objection sounded practical, but it revealed her complete misunderstanding of the relationship Emma and I had built. This wasn't about hiring a caregiver or finding someone to check on me. It was about mutual support and genuine affection between two people who'd chosen to be family. "I won't be living here as Margaret's caregiver," Emma explained patiently. "I'll be living here as her friend and tenant, just like any normal roommate situation. We look out for each other, but we're both independent adults with our own lives and responsibilities." Her clarification was important because it highlighted the difference between the relationship she and I had chosen and the dependency relationship my children had been trying to force on me. Emma saw me as an equal, not as a burden to be managed. David asked the question that had been hovering unspoken over the entire conversation. "Mom, are you happy with these arrangements? Really? Truly happy?" His concern sounded genuine rather than calculating, and I felt grateful that at least one of my children was interested in my actual feelings rather than just the legal implications of my decisions. My answer came from a place of deep satisfaction and relief that I'd found a solution that honored both my need for independence and my desire for meaningful connection. "David, I'm happier than I've been in years," I said honestly. "I wake up every morning in my own house, in my own bed, surrounded by my own things. Emma brings me stories from medical school and asks for advice about her studies. Maria shares vegetables from her garden and invites me to family celebrations where I'm treated as an honored guest. I have purpose, I have companionship, and I have security. What more could I want at 72? The truth in my words was evident to everyone at the table, including my children, who had to confront the reality that their plan to institutionalize me would have destroyed the very happiness they claimed to be protecting. Marcus pushed back from the table with obvious frustration, his businessman's mind still searching for angles that might give him some leverage in a situation that had spiraled completely out of his control. "But Mom, what about your safety? What if you fall, or have a stroke, or—" His litany of potential disasters sounded more like wishful thinking than genuine concern, especially since Emma's medical training made her far more qualified to handle emergencies than any of my children would be. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that he was questioning my safety arrangements while sitting in a room with a future doctor. "Marcus, I'm statistically safer living with a medical student than I would be in most nursing homes," I replied calmly. "Emma knows CPR, she understands my medications, and she has direct access to emergency medical services through the hospital. Plus, she's here by choice, rather than because it's her job." The comparison to nursing home care was deliberate and pointed. Emma's presence in my life was motivated by affection and mutual benefit, not by minimum wage and professional obligation. Emma stood to help clear the dessert plates, and I noticed how naturally she moved around my kitchen, already comfortable with where everything belonged. "Actually, having Margaret as a roommate has been incredibly helpful for my studies," she said, as she scraped plates. "She helps me practice patient communication skills, and her questions about medical terminology help me learn to explain complex concepts in simple language." Her comment revealed another dimension of our relationship that my children hadn't considered. I wasn't just receiving help, I was providing it in return. Sarah made one last attempt to find some flaw in the arrangements that might give them grounds to challenge my decisions. "What about the financial aspect? Are you paying Emma rent? Or is she paying you? How does that work with the house sale?" Her questions were clearly designed to uncover some irregularity that might suggest undue influence or financial exploitation, but my arrangements with Emma were completely transparent and legally sound. "Emma pays me $1,200 monthly in rent, which covers my property taxes and utilities," I explained. "The house sale was handled through Morrison, Klein and Associates with full legal documentation and independent appraisals. Everything was done properly and transparently. Harold Chen had insisted on complete legal compliance precisely to prevent the kind of challenges my children might attempt, and his thoroughness was now protecting both Emma and me from their desperate grasping." Jennifer leaned back in her chair with the defeated expression of someone who'd run out of professional options. As a real estate agent, she understood that the sale was legitimate and binding. As someone who'd been counting on inheriting this house, she was clearly struggling to accept that her assumptions about my assets had been completely wrong. The legal document spread across my table represented the end of her dreams about easy commissions and family windfalls. Maria, who'd been quietly observing the entire conversation while helping with cleanup, finally spoke with the wisdom of someone who'd seen plenty of family drama over the years. "Your mother is lucky to have found someone like Emma who treats her with respect and kindness," she said, her words carrying a subtle rebuke about what should be normal family behavior. "In our culture, we believe that how you treat your elders reflects who you are as a person." The cultural comparison was pointed and uncomfortable for my children, who clearly weren't measuring up well against Maria's standards. David was the first to acknowledge the truth that everyone else was dancing around. "Mom, I think what's hardest for us to accept is that we missed the signs that you were unhappy with our relationship," he said quietly. "We thought we were being responsible by planning for your future, but we never actually asked what kind of future you wanted." His honesty was refreshing and painful, acknowledging not just their mistakes, but the fundamental lack of communication that had led to this Thanksgiving disaster. "David, the planning wasn't the problem. It was the assumption that I was incapable of participating in my own planning," I replied gently. "You discussed my life like I was already gone, made decisions about my competency without consulting me, and treated my resistance as evidence of confusion rather than evidence of independence. My words were meant to educate rather than punish, though I could see from their faces that the education was painful for all of them to receive." Emma finished loading the dishwasher and turned to face my children with the kind of professional composure she'd probably learned from dealing with difficult patients' families. "I want you all to know that Margaret talks about you constantly," she said sincerely. "She's proud of your accomplishments, she worries about your families, and she loves you deeply, but she also deserves to be treated as an adult who can make her own choices about her life. Her defense of me was generous and diplomatic, offering my children a path back to relationship if they were willing to take it. Marcus stood abruptly, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "This whole situation is ridiculous," he said, gesturing toward the legal documents that had destroyed his plans. "A stranger gets our mother's house, controls her medical decisions, and benefits from years of her financial planning, while her own children are shut out completely." His resentment was understandable but misplaced. Emma hadn't stolen anything that had ever belonged to him, and my children had shut themselves out through their own behavior. "Emma isn't a stranger. She's someone who's earned my trust and affection through her actions," I said firmly. "And you haven't been shut out. You've been asked to treat me with the same respect you'd show any other adult whose decisions you might not agree with, but have no right to override." The distinction was important because it highlighted their choice. They could accept my autonomy and rebuild our relationship on healthier terms, or they could continue trying to control me and lose me entirely. Sarah surprised everyone by speaking up with what sounded like genuine remorse. "Mom, I think we got so focused on protecting you that we forgot to actually listen to you," she admitted. "When Jennifer suggested you might be getting confused, we should have talked to you directly instead of making plans behind your back." Her acknowledgement of their mistakes was a first step toward healing, though it remained to be seen whether she was willing to follow through with changed behavior rather than just changed words. "The confusion was never on my part," I said quietly. "I've been planning my future carefully and deliberately, consulting with professionals and making informed decisions about what would make me happiest. The confusion was in assuming that age automatically equals incompetence, and that children have the right to override their parents' choices simply because they're worried. My children had confused their anxiety with my incapacity, a common mistake that destroys families and strips elderly people of their dignity and autonomy." Emma picked up her folder and the legal documents, organizing them with the efficiency she'd probably learned from managing medical records. "I think maybe we should let everyone process today's information," she suggested diplomatically. "These are big changes, and it's natural that they'd take some time to understand and accept." Her suggestion was wise. Emotions were running too high for productive conversation, and my children needed time to adjust their expectations and figure out how to move forward. Maria stood and began gathering her things, clearly recognizing that the family discussion had reached its natural conclusion. "Margaret, thank you for including us in your Thanksgiving dinner," she said warmly. "Emma and I are grateful to be part of your family." Her words were another gentle reminder that family could be chosen rather than just inherited, and that my life had expanded to include people who valued my presence rather than just my assets. As my children prepared to leave, David approached me with something that looked like genuine regret in his eyes. "Mom, I'm sorry we handled this so badly," he said quietly. "I hope we can find a way to rebuild your trust in us." His apology felt sincere, and I found myself hoping that at least one of my children might be willing to do the work necessary to repair our relationship. Trust, once broken, had to be earned back through consistent actions rather than just words. "David, trust is rebuilt through behavior, not promises," I replied gently. "Show me that you respect my choices even when you disagree with them, and we can move forward together." The challenge I was offering him wasn't about money or inheritance. It was about treating me as an autonomous adult whose decisions deserved respect even when they were inconvenient for him. Whether he was willing to meet that challenge remained to be seen. Marcus and Sarah left without much more than stiff goodbyes, clearly too angry and embarrassed to attempt meaningful conversation. Jennifer paused at the door, her real estate instincts apparently still hoping to find some angle that might benefit her professionally. "If Emma ever decides to sell," she said quietly, "I hope she'll consider using our services." Even in defeat, she was still calculating potential business opportunities, which told me everything I needed to know about her priorities. After they left, Emma, Maria, and I sat in my living room with cups of coffee and slices of the pumpkin bread Emma had brought. The house felt peaceful in a way it hadn't in months, as if the air itself had been cleared by the honesty of the afternoon's conversations. Emma curled up in the chair that had been my husband's favorite, looking perfectly at home in what was now technically her house, but still felt completely like mine. That was intense, Emma said, with the understatement of someone who'd just witnessed a family implosion. I hope I didn't make things worse by being here. Her concern for my relationships with my children was touching, though unnecessary. She hadn't created the problems that had exploded today. She'd simply provided the catalyst that forced them into the open. Without her presence, my children might have continued their manipulation indefinitely. Emma, you didn't make anything worse. You made everything clearer, I assured her. My children needed to understand that I have options and allies, and that their threats about cutting me off from the family were empty because I'd already built a new family with people who actually wanted me in their lives. The truth was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. I no longer had to pretend that biological relationships were automatically more valuable than chosen ones. Maria patted my hand with the affection of someone who'd become a true friend over the past months. You handled that beautifully, she said with obvious admiration. Standing up to your own children takes courage, especially when they're trying to make you doubt your own judgment. Her support meant more than she probably realized because it came from someone who had no financial interest in my decisions, no inheritance to protect or lose, just genuine care for my well-being and happiness. As the evening wound down and Maria prepared to walk back to her own house, Emma surprised me with one final document from her seemingly endless folder. Actually, Margaret, I have something else to show you, she said with a smile that suggested good news rather than more legal complications. The paper she handed me was a letter from the University Hospital's administration, officially welcoming her to their residency program and outlining the benefits package that would support her during her training years. Look at the housing allowance section, Emma said, pointing to a specific paragraph in the letter. The university was offering her $800 monthly toward housing costs, which would significantly reduce the rent she'd been planning to pay me. But instead of keeping the savings for herself, she'd already calculated how the extra money could benefit both of us. Her generosity and forward thinking reminded me why I'd chosen her as my successor and ally in creating a different kind of future. This means I can afford to contribute more toward the house maintenance and utilities, Emma explained. I was thinking we could use the extra money to install that new security system you mentioned wanting, maybe upgrade the internet for my medical research, and still have enough left over for a shared grocery budget. Her suggestions transformed our landlord-tenant relationship into something more like a partnership, with both of us contributing according to our abilities and benefiting according to our needs. The security system was something I'd wanted for years, but had hesitated to install because of the cost and complexity. With Emma's technical knowledge and additional housing allowance, it suddenly became feasible in a way that excited me more than I'd expected. The prospect of feeling completely safe in my own home, knowing that help was just a button press away, was worth more than any inheritance my children might have provided. As I walked Emma and Maria to the door, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction with the day's revelations. The Thanksgiving dinner I'd planned as a family reconciliation had instead become a family reckoning, forcing everyone to confront truths that had been hidden beneath polite assumptions and unspoken expectations. My children now knew exactly where they stood in my life, and more importantly, I knew exactly where I stood in theirs. Thank you for including us in your family, Emma said as she hugged me goodbye. This house is going to be a wonderful place for both of us to build our futures. Her words carried the promise of shared tomorrows rather than just shared legal documents, and I realized that in saving myself from my children's institutional plans, I'd also created opportunities for joy and purpose that I'd never expected to find at 72. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, in my own house, with sunlight streaming through windows I'd looked through for over 30 years. Emma was already in the kitchen making coffee, her medical textbooks spread across the table where legal documents had dominated the day before. The transition from crisis to normalcy felt surreal, but also deeply satisfying. I'd stood up for my right to self-determination and won not just independence, but companionship with someone who genuinely valued my presence in her life. Over breakfast, Emma shared her plans for the house renovations we'd discussed, her ideas practical but also respectful of the home's history and character. She wanted to update the electrical system for safety, but preserve the vintage light fixtures my husband had installed. She planned to modernize the kitchen appliances, but keep the original cabinetry that held so many memories of family meals and holiday preparations. Her approach to change honored the past while embracing the future, exactly what I'd hoped for when I'd chosen her as my successor. The phone rang that afternoon, and I wasn't surprised to see David's number on the caller ID. His voice sounded tentative, almost shy, as he asked if he could visit again soon to continue our conversation in a calmer atmosphere. His willingness to reach out so quickly after the previous day's revelations suggested that he might be the one child capable of rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms, and I found myself cautiously hopeful about the possibility of healing at least one of the rifts that had opened. Marcus called 2 days later, his tone more businesslike, but also more respectful than it had been during Thanksgiving dinner. He'd apparently consulted with his own attorney and confirmed that all my legal arrangements were binding and unchallengeable, but instead of expressing anger, he asked if we could discuss how the family trust might work in practice. His shift from opposition to curiosity suggested that he was beginning to understand that cooperation might serve his interests better than confrontation. Sarah surprised me by showing up at my door the following weekend with a bouquet of flowers and what appeared to be a genuine apology. She'd spent the week thinking about our conversation and had realized that her focus on financial planning had blinded her to the emotional aspects of my situation. Her accounting mind had calculated inheritance values, but had never calculated the cost of treating me like a burden rather than a beloved family member. But it was Emma's presence in my daily life that made all the difference in how I processed these tentative reconciliations with my children. Having someone in the house who was genuinely happy to see me each morning, who asked about my day and shared stories from her own experiences, created a foundation of security that made me less desperate for my children's approval and more able to set healthy boundaries about how I expected to be treated. As winter settled over our neighborhood, I watched Emma transform from a tenant into something much more like the daughter I'd always hoped to have, someone who saw my wisdom as valuable rather than outdated, who appreciated my experience rather than dismissing it as irrelevant, and who understood that independence and interdependence weren't contradictory, but complementary ways of building meaningful relationships across generations. The folder that had sat on my dining room table for 3 weeks before that fateful Thanksgiving had served its purpose, revealing truths and reshaping relationships in ways that changed everything about my future. But more than that, it had taught me that family isn't just about blood connections or legal obligations. It's about who shows up, who cares, and who treats you with the dignity and respect that every human being deserves, regardless of their age or circumstances. If you're dealing with family members who think age gives them the right to make your decisions, remember that you have more power than they want you to believe. Don't let anyone convince you that getting older means giving up control over your own life. Sometimes the best family is the one you choose for yourself, and the strongest legacy is the one you create through your own courage and wisdom.